Today on Cryptic Mass Guitar, we do a high-gain cabinet shootout between my Mesa Boogie standard, so the oversized 4x12 slant rectifier cabinet. This cabinet here has UK vintage 30s. Usually you hear me saying C90s. I'll explain. And we're going to put that up against my Marshall 1960A. The A is for angled. This is not an oversized cabinet. This has the G12T 75s. I'm going to do this as quick as possible, and then we'll get into the sound samples. So, a couple of things with this video. Second sound sample, so the E standard. Look at my pinky knuckle on my picking hand. Yeah, I hit a door. And yeah, this swole up to, well, in the video, it's about like 2 inches big. It swole up to about 4 or 5 inches. It was not fun. Boo-hoo to me. It's kind of funny to look back on the video. Number 2, and the most important, I was a nice guy. I don't regret being a nice guy. There's someone I know out here who blew his cabinet and was doing a very important recording session where he needed an oversized cabinet. So I was stupid, and I lent the my Mesa oversized 4x12 slant cabinet with the C90s in it, and he blew the C90s. Then I have to say thank you to a viewer in Edmonton named Paul, which I always get confused when people watch these videos because it gets weird sometimes at music stores. But this was his cabinet. It's a used cabinet, has the UK vintage 30s in it. He was in the process of actually getting some Eminence speakers, I don't know which, and he was going to sell the vintage 30s that are in here. And instead, he contacted me because I said, oh crap, what do I do? And he said, hey, yeah, just if you want, I'll take your old cabinet, you can take my cabinet, you can give me a little bit of money, which the gentleman who blew my C90s did, and now I have this with the UK vintage 30s. Yeah. Anyway, I do have 3 sound samples for you today. The first 2, one is DADGAD in C, so I do riff, 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 lead, lead. The second one, which is the swollen hand one, that is an E standard. It's in like a scooped setting. A Mark V, I think I used. Riff, 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 lead, lead. And then, I'll talk to you again before we do this, but I'll do a blended sound sample. So, hard pan left, hard pan right, lead, and then a lead, so you can hear how they sound and mix together. right, so now you've heard the first two sound samples and saw my, misshapen knuckle. Let's go ahead and do hard pan left, hard pan right, and then a lead, and then a lead. I'm going to tell you, usually the C90 and the G1275T is what I say is like an amazing mixture of speakers together. However, the UK Vintage 30, because the Engel cabinet that I have, that has Chinese Vintage 30s, so the upper mid-range is very different in that than this. So this, in comparison to the C90, has less high-end and a little more body. So that mixed with the G12T 75s, which has a lot of high-end, not like booming low-end, but a nice sounding mid-range to it, not overbearing or anything like that. It just works really well. So I am also going to use one of those periphery drop G, they call it, which I just call it GG tuning. So you'll see the tuning like up here or somewhere, up here I think. So that's the tuning that I'm using there, so I found it a little interesting. I'll keep experimenting with that because I don't know if I did it properly or not. Alright, so that's it for all the different sound samples. So I'll talk about my thoughts with both of these cabinets here, and then kind of like the comparison kind of a deal with them. I'm going to first talk about the Vintage 30s here. And I will say that blended sound sample that you heard with this hard pan left, this hard pan right, that was the first one that I recorded. So the reason I wanted to do that is I wanted to hear how well this mixed with this. And again, it sounded fantastic. Generally, the C90s, they have a lot more top end in them. They're not overbearing. Some people can say they are. Not nearly as much as this guy over here. But with the Vintage 30s here, the UK Vintage 30s, there's a lot more body. And there's not as much top end, but it's not like it's missing that top end. It's hard to explain. So with the C90, it just had this really sweet top end, which works really well with my ears. But this here has like a steady top end and that upper mid-range, and just has a lot of nice, deep, rich low end. And that mixture of that low end, like it's just the frequencies are fantastic on this. So yeah, the Vintage 30 centimeter speaker just really works increasingly well. What I typically do with most speakers, depending on how their top end is, so how I record this or get the sounds of this, a little different how I do this. So what I generally like to do, I use a Neumann TLM 107. I use that because it sounds like the cabinet. An SM57, 7B, i5, A609, all of those, with my ears, if I'm just recording guitars along with, drums, no bass and no vocals or anything like that, I'll use a TLM 107 because it sounds like the cabinet. Those other microphones, they have this weird synthetic top end that I keep hearing, which I don't think really works for what I'm going for, to accurately represent the cabinet. However, like in a mix, those work really well because they kind of filter out certain sounds and they focus on certain frequencies really well in comparison to a TLM 107, which still works in recording, but that's why I'm using a TLM 107. But I generally start off about 11 to 12 inches away from the speaker. I then kind of have it a little bit off axis, aimed towards the cone, so the center of the speaker. For the Vintage 30 here, it just worked. Aimed at the cone, off axis, it just worked. I think what I would do, if it wasn't working for me and I was like, it's not exactly what I'd like to do, I would back it off a little more. So I would actually bring it out so I, get further and further away from any type of proximity effect. And I think that would actually work a little better. This guy with the G12 T75s, because there's a lot of high end in this, the speaker here, it's funny because a lot of people hate the speaker, and the people who don't hate the speaker usually go, I didn't know people hated this speaker. What is this you're talking about? But this here does tend to have a lot more top end to it. And it can be overbearing in some situations. So what I'll do with this is I'll start again 11 to 12 inches away. And I'll have it off axis aimed towards the cone. But that generally sounds a little too much, a little too overbearing. So what I'll do is I'll actually start shifting it away from the center of the cone. And I'll bring it, more towards the middle. And then, like, middle of the speaker, not exactly, like, I'll bring it, like, an inch or two away, and then I'll start moving it over. I'll do that with this speaker before actually bringing it back too far. Because I always find that magic sweet spot is, like, between 11 and 14 inches. And with a lot of speakers, I can get away with, off axis towards the cone, between 11 and 14 inches away. This guy here just works so much better if you're not aiming at the cone, you're aiming just a little bit off center. The Vintage 30, or Vintage 30 centimeter, the 12-inch speaker here, I need more time with this particular cabinet. To kind of get a little more acquainted with it and with how I might want to capture a little more high end in it, just because I am used to that C90. But it just seems that it's a fantastic speaker, especially in comparison to the Angle cabinet, which has the Chinese, I believe, Vintage 30s in it. But one thing that you'll always kind of note is Vintage 30s. You could get like an orange vintage, or an orange 4x12 versus a Mesa 4x12 versus a Marshall 4x12 that has the G12 vintage, which are Vintage 30s. Those three, if you recorded those, they're going to sound completely different. Well, I mean, not completely, but the upper mid-range is going to sound different from each cabinet. It's generally to do with the speakers, and then, of course, the size of the cabinet and the construction and everything like that. But the speakers themselves, there's so much variance in Vintage 30s that I've always had a problem with kind of committing to saying that the Vintage 30 is the best speaker, because a lot of people do believe that, and I mean, I don't disagree with them. It's a fantastic speaker, but there's just, you could have 10 different cabinets and they all have vintage 30s in them and they're going to sound different. It's just one of those things. But yeah, I definitely need a lot more time with this to kind of see how I want to capture maybe a little more top end out of the speaker without, you know, going to the amp or doing anything in post. In post, a lot of people do ask me about this. What I generally do in post, you'll generally have to correct for the microphone. So you don't want too many booming frequencies. And you don't want too many shrill high end. So what I'll generally do is I'll take down a little bit of the low end and then a little bit of the top end. And then I'll just generally leave everything else alone because I still want it to sound like what the speaker sounds like. You know, if I've invested the money in a good microphone that actually sounds like the cabinet, then why mess with that, right? So, I'm going to stop talking now, and I'll say thank you very much for watching. Thanks for watching.